Hello guys and welcome to Barking Mad Tabletop. My name is Nick and today marks the first ever episode of QuestBoard, a series in which I will be talking about, discussing and giving my opinions on various RPGs and RPG related products. It's not going to be a super frequent series because ultimately there is only so much money in my wallet and time in a year, and I don't want to talk about review products that I haven't actually used or played. So it's not going to be super frequent, but rest assured that if I'm talking about a game on this channel, I have actually run or played it. So, without any further ado, let's talk about the gritty, dark fantasy game I had the pleasure of running this past New Year's Eve, The Witcher tabletop role-playing game. The Witcher role-playing game was first released by R. Talsorian Games on August 2nd, 2018, and since then numerous supplements have been released both as paid material and free downloads from R. Talsorian's website. The game is based on the Witcher series of video games by Polish developer CD Projekt Red, which in turn are a continuation of the series of short stories and novels written by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. The world of The Witcher is one of dark fantasy with a distinctly Eastern European twist, basing much of its mythology and monsters off ancient folktales. These elements are then blended with more standard fantasy fare, elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and so on and so forth. In addition to the otherworldly monsters and ancient peoples, the setting is jam-packed with political intrigue and maneuvering, brutal warfare, and lots and lots of death. Overall, I think it makes for a very unique setting that combines things that are unfamiliar to a Western European and American audience with the familiar trappings of high fantasy. To play the Witcher RPG, you only really need the core rulebook, which does contain all the fundamental rules for the game and adventure, all the player races, all the professions, all the equipment, stuff like that, but all these have since been expanded on in various supplements. When it comes to dice, the only kind you'll need are d10s and d6s. I recommend at least 2 d10s in case one of them pisses you off, and also certain situations call for a d100 roll, and at least 4 d6s. That should cover you for a while. So, jumping right in with what is probably my favourite aspect of this system, character creation. Character creation begins with picking a race for your player character. If you are just using the core rulebook, you have the options of Witcher, which is also a profession, I'll get to that later, Elf, Dwarf, and Human. Though further options like halflings and gnomes are available in various supplements. Each race has an associated social standing, which will affect how NPCs view and interact with your character, and this will change depending on where exactly in the world you currently are. Witches, for example, are hated and feared in the Northern Kingdoms and in Nilfgaard, but tolerated in Skellige and Dol Blathanna. These social statuses, hated, feared, and tolerated, and equal, all have associated modifiers that get applied in, various circumstances. For example, if you are hated, you take a -2 penalty to various social skills in situations where it applies. For example, an elf dealing with a human in the Northern Kingdoms would take the penalty, whereas if they were interacting with another elf or human from Nilfgaard, they wouldn't. Besides social standing, each race also has a set of racial perks, various bonuses and abilities that differentiate them from one another mechanically. Elves, for example, are natural marksmen and have an innate +2 bonus to their archery skill, whereas dwarves, who are naturally brawny, have a +1 to their physique skill and can carry more before being encumbered. After choosing your character's race, it is time to go through their life path. I absolutely adore the life path system. The Witcher RPG is not the only rule set to use a life path system. I know Arthas or in other games, Cyberpunk has one. Traveller also uses one, and there's options for it both in Pathfinder 2e, with the deep background variant in the Game Mastery Guide, and with the Heroic Chronicle present in the Explorer's Guide to Wildman book for D&D 5e. Basically, what a life path is a way to either choose or randomly generate the basic aspects of your character's backstory in a way that integrates very well into the setting you're playing in. Now, it doesn't give you everything word for word, rather it essentially gives you prompts that you can work off in creating your character's backstory. In the case of the Witcher RPG, you start by determining where exactly you're from, which gives you a bonus to your skill. Then you move on to determining the status of your family. Are they alive? Did something happen to them? You can really get down in the weeds with this, generating how many siblings you have, if any, and then determining their various personalities, an influential mentor in your character's life, and so on and so forth. After that, you move on to life events, i.e. things that have happened to your character during their life. You get one life event for every full decade your character's been alive, and you determine the nature of these life events by rolling a d10. These range from finding a jackpot that lets you start with extra money, falling into debt, making an ally or an enemy, or even being involved in a romance. These all, of course, have various variations depending on what exactly it is you roll. After your life events, you go on to determine more incidental stuff about your character, like their hairstyle and style of clothing they prefer. All in all, I find the life path system to be very interesting and engaging, and I've had lots of fun just rolling up characters randomly with my friends over Discord using these tools. Overall, honestly, I think the life path system should be a default tool in more systems, because I think it is such a wonderful way of integrating a character cleanly into the setting. Once you've completed your life path, it's time to choose your character's profession. The Witcher RPG is a skill-based system rather than a level-based one, and so professions aren't exactly classes, but in many ways they are quite similar. Your profession determines your basic skill set, but it doesn't lock you into it, and when you get improvement points you can absolutely branch out. There is the defining skill that each profession has that sort of is only specific to that profession, but beyond that you can really absolutely branch out during the course of play. Though it should be noted that if you don't start with a spellcasting profession, you cannot then become a spellcaster later on. The core rulebook includes 9 professions, those being Bard, Craftsman, Criminal, Mage, Man-at-Arms, Doctor, Merchant, Priest, and Witcher. Additionally, in the Lords and Lands booklet that comes with the GM screen, you'll find an additional profession called the Noble. Each comes with a basic skill package that helps determine your starting skills and basic starting equipment. Each profession also comes with a defining ability, a skill with a specific application which eventually branches out into several skill trees that you can advance through during the course of play. Once you've chosen your character's profession, it's time to determine their basic statistics. There are 9 main statistics in the Witcher RPG, those being intelligence, which covers things like deduction, solving puzzles, performing sciences, and stuff like that. Reflexes, which is used for dodging, fighting in melee, stuff like that. Dexterity, which pertains to ranged attacks and anything that might require like finesse or hand-eye coordination, like lockpicking, for example. Body, which is physical strength and endurance. Speed, which determines your speed, how fast you can move. Empathy, which is sort of like charisma in a lot of other games. It is the social skill that governs things like persuading or seducing someone. Craft, which is a pretty wide stat. It covers things like using machinery, smithing something, but it also applies to like treating people's wounds if you're a doctor. And then there's will, which relates to a lot of things again. Intimidating someone, for example, keys off your will stat, as does casting spells and resisting magic. Finally, we have luck, which is a bit different from the others. It is more like a pool of points that you can use to give yourself bonuses before a roll. Each point of luck spent gives you a +1, but you have to choose how many points you're spending before you roll. And I think, they refresh at the beginning of every session, essentially. You can determine your basic statistics in one of 2 ways. Either you roll 1d10 9 times, re-rolling any 1s or 2s, and then you assign each rolled score where you'd like it. Alternatively, if your GM prefers, you can use a pool of stat points that you can either split up and assign where you'd like. The core rulebook gives 4 tiers of these point pools that you can choose depending on what sort of game you're looking to run, like, is it an average game, is it a heroic game, or a legendary game, stuff like that. And those tiers go from 60 points at the lowest tier of the pool to 80 points at the highest. Unlike in games like Pathfinder or D&D, these basic statistics and the figures derived from them generally don't change during the course of a campaign. Now that you have your core statistics figured out, it's time to determine your derived stats. These include Vigor, if you're a spellcaster, Stun, Run, and Leap, as well as HP, Stamina, and Recovery. Your Vigor score, if you have one at all, is determined by your profession. Your Run is determined by multiplying your Speed stat by 3, and your Leap stat equals your Run stat divided by 5. The other derived stats are determined by combining your Body and Will stats, and then dividing that total in half, and then consulting a table in the book. Your Body stat also determines how much you can carry without being encumbered, and what your melee damage bonus is. Vigor governs how many spells you can cast in one round. Stun is a stat you need to roll against to resist being, stunned. Run is how far you can move if you spend your whole turn moving, and Leap is how far you can jump with a running start. HP should be self-explanatory. It's how much damage you can take before being downed or entering the death state, as they call it in this game. Stamina, on the other hand, is a bit more interesting. It's a pool of points that you can use to take various actions, most prominently by casting spells or defending yourself against an enemy. I'll go over that when we get to the combat. The final part of character creation is getting your skills in order. Each skill is tied to a certain base statistic. For example, awareness is tied to intelligence, whilst something like swordsmanship is tied to reflexes. And each profession has a skill package that determines your starting skills. You have a total of 44 skill points that you can split as you like between these skills and your your profession's defining ability, though you must have at least one skill point in each. Once that's done, you gain an additional number of skill points equal to your intelligence stat plus your reflex stat, and you can spend these on either improving the skills you already have or picking up new ones. At character creation, the cap for a skill is 6. And as you play and earn improvement points, you can spend those points to improve these further to a cap of 10. Certain racial modifiers can raise skills above 6 at character creation, and these modifiers also enable you to go above 10 later on. There are a lot of skills in the Witcher RPG, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on them, but essentially they are the main way you engage mechanically with the system. Pretty much anything is solved with a skill check, even combat rolls, casting spells, and essentially everything is solved with a skill check. Now that we've covered the basics of character creation, let's talk a bit about actually playing the game itself. The basic rhythm of play in the Witcher RPG isn't going to be particularly unfamiliar to you if you've ever played a game like D&D or Pathfinder, or honestly really any game that has a GM. The GM narrates the scene, the locale, the what have you, and the players describe what they'd like to do, what actions they might want to take, and if those actions have a chance of failure or something going wrong or for some other reason seem to require a roll, the GM calls for an appropriate roll against the difficulty set by the GM. The basic modifier for any given roll is usually composed of 2 numbers. One number is the statistic that governs the skill you're rolling, and one is your level in that skill. These 2 numbers put together are referred to as your base. For example, if a character with an intelligence of 7 and an awareness skill of 8, that character's base for awareness is 15, which is what they add to their awareness rolls. There can then also be other miscellaneous modifiers depending on the circumstances, so the basic formula for a roll in the Witcher RPG is 1d10 plus your statistic, plus your skill, which is referred to as your base, plus any circumstantial modifiers. If the total of the roll exceeds the DC, you are successful, but if it meets or falls below it, you are not. One interesting aspect of skill resolutions in this game is what happens when you roll a 10 or a 1 on your die. If you roll a 10, that is what is called a critical, and the die explodes, meaning you get to roll it again and add the number to your total. This continues to happen until you roll anything other than a 10, meaning that if you are on a lucky streak, you can end up with some crazy high totals. If you roll a 1, however, that is called a fumble. Again, the dice explodes, and you must roll it again, this time subtracting the number rolled from your total. Like on a critical, rolling a 10 on a fumble roll means you keep rolling. Exploding dice aren't a great mechanic for every system, but where they do fit, they are quite a bit of fun in my opinion. So now that we've talked a bit about the basic rhythm of play and skill resolution in this game, let's talk about the combat. Combat in the Witcher RPG, like in many other systems, is measured in rounds. In the case of this game, each round lasts 3 seconds. The turn order, like in many systems, is determined by rolling initiative, which you do by rolling 1d10 and adding your reflexes stat. Any initiative ties are resolved by simply rolling again between the tied characters, but otherwise maintaining the overall initiative order. In one turn, a player character can move a number of meters equal to their speed, and can I just say how much I adore the fact that Artalsorian uses the metric system in their games, and perform one action. This action includes any number of things like attacking, casting a spell, using a skill to do something, like, I don't know, picking a lock, or if combat was sprung on you unexpectedly, drawing a weapon. There are also some full round actions you can take, like running, which lets you move 3 times your speed in meters. As a note, if you are using a standard 1-inch tabletop grid, each square represents 2 meters. If you take a full round action, you can obviously not take any other actions on your turn by default. However, if you want to take an extra action on your turn, you can spend 3 stamina to do so, also taking a -3 penalty to whatever roll you need to make to perform that action. Attacking and casting offensive spells are all resolved by opposed rolls in the Witcher RPG. In case of weapon attacks, it's the total of the attacker's appropriate weapon skill roll versus the total of the defender's defense skill roll. Every character, monster, and NPC can take one defensive action for free every round, but if they want to take further such actions, they can do so at the cost of 1 point of stamina. If a character or creature is unable or chooses not to defend itself, the attacker only needs to beat a DC 10 to land the attack. I find this system interesting as it means a defender is always doing something active like dodging, blocking, or repositioning. It doesn't fit every system, but it was quite engaging and my group had a lot of fun with it when we played. When you attack with a melee weapon, you can choose to either make 2 fast strikes or 1 strong strike. With fast strikes, you can target 2 different enemies as long as they're within your reach, but you cannot move in between the strikes, and if an enemy successfully takes the reposition defense against your first strike, you cannot then target them with the second. A strong strike, on the other hand, takes a -3 penalty to the skill check, but deals double damage on a hit. If an attack hits, you then roll a d10 to determine where exactly you hit, which matters quite a bit. A hit on an arm or a leg halves the damage, whereas a hit on the head triples it. There are also 4 different categories of critical wounds you can inflict, depending on by how much you beat your opponent's defense roll. If you beat it by 7 or more, that's a simple critical. If you beat it by 10 or more, that's a complex critical. And then there's difficult at 13, and finally deadly at 15. These critical wounds can be really nasty. All of them add a hefty amount of extra damage and range from pretty severe debuffs to just killing an enemy or a player character outright. A critical wound also forces a creature to make a stun save or be, well, stunned. Rolling a 10 on your die functions in the same way in combat as for general skill rolls, but does not guarantee success or a critical wound. You still have to beat your opponent's defense roll. If, however, you fumble on a combat action, no matter if you succeed or not, you need to roll on the fumble table, which has a wide array of different outcomes depending on what exactly you were trying to do when you fumbled. Once you determined if you hit, where you hit, and if you crit, it's time to roll damage. You do so by rolling the specified number of dice for your weapon and adding your physical damage bonus and or any other bonus damage specified by the weapon itself, multiplying it by the number determined by the hit location, and then finally subtracting the stopping power, or SP, of the armor your opponent is wearing at that particular location. For monsters, if you're attacking with a steel weapon, they also take half that damage because they are resistant to non-silver weapons mechanically, but this is the basic formula in all cases. Spells work pretty similarly to melee attacks in this regard. The spellcaster rolls a spellcasting check versus an opponent's resist magic check, or dodge escape, or some other defense action depending on the spell in question, and then any damage is determined similarly. There is, however, a separate fumble table that comes into play for spellcasting. Spells cost stamina to cast, similar to using defense actions, and a spellcaster can use an amount of stamina points equal to their vigor statistic every round. If they use more stamina than that vigor threshold, they start damaging themselves as they're essentially channeling too much raw chaotic energy through their bodies at any given time. Spells generally have a set stamina cost, the only exception being Witcher signs, which have a variable stamina cost. When it comes to death and dying in the Witcher RPG, it's not like a lot of other tabletop games where you get multiple attempts at trying to survive. Rather, once you go below 0 HP, you enter what's called the death state. And in the death state, all your stats, both primary and derived, are reduced to 1/3 their normal amount, and you have to roll a death save against your unmodified stun stat, the same as if you were trying to avoid being stunned in another circumstance, for example. If you fail that roll, you are dead. You are gone. There is no bringing you back, there's no resurrection magic, there's no raise dead, there's no revivify. You are just gone. But if you succeed that roll, you are not back, you're not awake, you're still unconscious and you're still dying, and it becomes more difficult for you to succeed, as your stun stat is modified by a -1. So, unless dying is on the agenda for you, someone in your party really needs to stabilize you with a successful first aid or healing hands check. In-combat healing in the Witcher RPG is quite limited. There's a few healing spells and Witcher potions which restore health points gradually over time, but beyond that, recovering lost hit points is a pretty slow process. Doctors can stabilize and treat critical wounds to lessen and in most cases eventually negate their ill effects, but this takes anywhere from a day to a few weeks of recovery time. Combat in the Witcher RPG can be quite dangerous. Damage tends to be quite high and hit points pretty low, and they don't really increase over the course of a campaign. So you pretty much always want to be trying to defend yourself, because healing can take a long time. Overall, both me and my group enjoyed the combat in The Witcher, but as you can see, it's not particularly streamlined. There's a lot of rolling going on with the defense actions, determining hit location, if you crit, and if so, what sort of crit it is, and then rolling to determine exactly what the crit is. Well, the critical wounding question is, rather. And while this was all pretty engaging, I personally don't mind that sort of crunch. It does make for a pretty slow combat, so if you're looking for a fast, streamlined combat, this is probably not the game for you. Overall, I quite enjoyed my time with The Witcher RPG, but there are a few things that I had an issue with. I already mentioned one in regards to the combat and the amount of rolling that takes place and how that slows it down a bit. But that's something you can eventually overcome, I think, with enough time and, you know, practice, I suppose. Like, just playing the system, you will naturally overcome that obstacle. Another issue I have is that I don't think the core rulebook is particularly well laid out. There's a lot of space taken up by these massive tables or pieces of admittedly beautiful art that sort of squeeze text into awkwardly formatted sidebars or blocks of text that can sort of make it a little annoying to read. There's also a few nitpicks I have here in regards to what I assume to be mistakes or things that were changed at some point in the development process, but the change wasn't properly reflected in the final layout of the book. But those are mostly small things that don't really merit taking up too much time in this video. The big thing I do have an issue with, however, is the official character sheet, which I honestly think is just not very good at all. The major issues are that while there are no boxes where you can note your maximum HP and stamina, there are no boxes for you to track them in active play. Likewise, there's no space allocated on the sheet for you to write down your pre-calculated skill bases. This means whenever you're called on to make a check, you're always looking in two different places for your modifiers, which in my opinion gets pretty fucking annoying. Thankfully, there are several fan-made character sheets that solve this problem, which can be found on the game's subreddit, but if there's ever a future edition of this game, I would absolutely like to see the character sheet get a major overhaul. I find that outside of combat, a lot of the rules are sort of left to player and GM interpretation, so it doesn't quite have the GM rule support that something like Pathfinder 2e has. Now, whether that's something desirable is obviously down to personal preference, but it's absolutely worth noting, if nothing else. I think this sort of setup works better for a game actually designed for it, unlike some other games that I won't mention by name at this particular moment. I think a game like The Witcher works best with a more experienced GM, who's already learned the art of applying consistently fair rulings to various situations that might be unclear, which is something that can take a while to master. Me and my group had a really good time playing The Witcher RPG this past New Year's Eve. I ran the adventure that's included in the core rulebook. I think it's called To All a Good Night, and we had a blast, quite frankly. My players were all big fans of the active defending, the dodging out of the way, and despite my reservations as to the amount of rolls you have to do to fully resolve an attack, landing that big headshot and tripling the damage was absolutely an endorphin rush for my players, and also me when I landed one on them. I'd say the game works best for a relatively roleplay heavy group. Certain professions like the Bard, for example, really excel in social situations rather than combat. And combat's obviously pretty deadly and takes a long time to recover from, so all combat all the time isn't something that I think really fits the paradigm of the game system. So in conclusion, if you're a dark fantasy fan, especially if you're a fan of The Witcher specifically, and you don't mind a fairly crunchy combat system, then I absolutely do recommend trying out The Witcher RPG. You can find a free quick start for it on Drive-Thru RPG called The Witcher Easy Mode. That comes with simplified rules, pre-generated characters, and a sample adventure. So if you're interested in what I've described, I absolutely recommend checking that out. If, on the other hand, you're looking for a more light-hearted game with fast-paced combat, I do suggest looking elsewhere. If you're going to be playing this game, I absolutely do suggest using one of the fan-made character sheets that you can find on the subreddit. I'll leave a link to those in the description below. So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It wasn't necessarily meant to be a super in-depth review, more of an overview of the system and what I thought of it. There's a few things I didn't go into, like rules around layering armor and facing in combat, as well as the crafting system, mostly because we didn't really engage with that when we were playing, and I didn't want to review it without, having actual experience with it. At this point, I'm unsure if I'll be running a long-term campaign using this system, but I'm absolutely interested in running further one-shots. Yeah, I guess that's it. With all that said, thank you for watching, and see you all next time.